Hi. Hello to, I know quite a few people in the room, so hello. And hello to the people I don't know. It was interesting to me to do this talk because everybody here knows a little bit about digital. Sometimes I have to do a talk and then people know so little about the computer that first you have to even explain why you would make something on the computer. But I think everybody here understands why you would make something on the computer. So I think the topic of digital abstraction is at the core of what I do. So I want to begin at the beginning. When I started making work, I remember thinking it's about the idea and the form can be whatever form, and I didn't want to repeat myself, but it ended up that I found a form that was the most efficient, so then you do repeat yourself, but you get to try different ideas. So in the beginning, you think about composition. Somebody's speakerphone. In the beginning, you think about composition in service of the idea. As an example, my very first work. So here, the composition is not the main topic of the work. I mean, I thought about how to place the head in the frame, but it would not have been a very different work if the head was on the left or on the right. I think it would have been the same experience. So that's the beginning. And then slowly, in the beginning, I had a sense of guilt with fully abstract work. So I still thought it needed a topic. Because there's this thing with abstraction that it is so easy on the computer to make abstract work. It's really nothing. It's not that easy to make an abstract painting because you have to buy a canvas, you have to sand it, you have to make the surface really nice, and if you want to make a perfect square on a canvas, it's quite difficult. Or if you want to paint like Bridget Riley, that's extremely difficult. Every time you sneeze, you ruin the painting, and you have to start all over. But to make an abstract work on the computer is almost the easiest thing you can do. If you want to make a black square, then it's really not that hard. So that's a lot easier than painting a black square. So then you have to think, what can I do on the computer that I cannot do, and that already, because so much happened in abstract art. So what can you bring to the table? So this is an example of a work where the idea for me was that if you have a parallel perspective, not linear perspective, then things in the background are just as big as things in the foreground. And that means things can grow indefinitely. So it could have just been blocks, but I decided to make stacks of money. I'm still happy I did that, but as you see, in the beginning, I wasn't ready for abstraction, and it's a difficult thing because abstraction is so easy and non-offensive. Nobody's offended at all if you make abstract art. So that's tricky because you have to offend a little bit, I think. But this is one of the first works that was kind of abstract, from 2002. But it's not really abstract because it's a portrait of the gradient tool from Photoshop. So I thought it was interesting to show the tool itself, not the result, but this idea that in Photoshop you drag a line and between those 2 points it makes a gradient. So that was the first work, and then here is the next work. So what I'm trying to do is, with either interaction or randomness, you can do things that you cannot do in video, or that you cannot do. So here there's a number of shapes and a number of patterns that are inside the shapes, and it's constantly choosing a different shape or a different content, and that makes this idea of an infinite collage, a collage that never repeats itself. So that was an interesting point for me. What happens if an artwork, every time it's displayed, it's different? Which I think is a lot of computer artists, that's one of the first things you do. You discover that you can make things that never repeat themselves. And I also think it's interesting to think about abstraction, that abstraction doesn't have to mean completely abstract. It can also be the path to abstraction, where We have real life, which is if we're in Switzerland and you walk through the mountains, that's very far from abstract. And then you have video, that's a little more abstract, or you have realistic drawing, or you have this, and then you can slowly go towards more abstract. But I've always been interested in finding, especially with movement, that you can leave a lot to the imagination. You can make something so simple that as a still, you probably wouldn't understand what it is, but the movement gives you the suggestion. Another example. So I'm interested in using the absolute minimum possible to still convey because when you think about it, a beach is a beach. And to take a picture of a beach is not a beach. So what's the ultimate beach in a browser? What's the best way of showing a beach in a browser? And then this was my conclusion. So this is in a way, I'm making images that are not abstract, but that are honest that they were made on the computer. They're not trying to be realistic and breaking down what I see into elements that work well on a computer. Trying to give the computer something that the computer doesn't have to do so much. The computer can relax a little bit. So again, this is but still the problem of composition goes further in the sense that the browser is always a different size. Everyone's computer is different, so I always thought that was an interesting problem where a painter normally, when you make a landscape painting, you decide if you make a small one or a big one, you decide if you make something very long or square or portrait orientation. And in this case, the work adapts itself to the user. So if someone is looking on their phone, it might look like this. And lots of people have lots of browser windows open. So I was always aware that the browser is a weird, fluid medium, and that the work has to adapt to any possible space. And also, the work on the internet has to really grab you the first second, because it's such a busy environment that I decided it has to be this work that you can either watch for 1 second, and you've seen everything, or you can watch it for a week. But the sense that there's no beginning or end, but that it can grab you immediately, but you can also come back to it later. So I think a lot of people email this work around and then see it briefly, and then some people told me that they would have a second monitor in their office, and while they work, they have this work. It's like part of them, and they can have a different work every week. So this was an interesting point for me, where I was trying to translate what I see in the real world and bring that to the computer. So video games become more and more realistic. So you need a bigger graphics card, you need a heavier computer, you want more frame rate, you want more polygons, that we can go to photorealism. That's the goal, that at some point games cannot be distinguished from real life. I was always interested in finding this language that doesn't need heavy hardware and that is honest about that it's a computer image. So this was a point where I've been sitting in trains my whole life in the Netherlands, and we don't have any mountains, it's the opposite of Switzerland. So I was trying to translate that feeling of this Dutch grid that you go by, and how do I translate that to a computer image? And so I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to use realistic colors, because when you're in sunlight and you see the grass, but you see the sun reflecting in the water, it's a huge contrast, but it's not much contrast in terms of color. It's a light blue and the light is quite muted. So to convey that sense of contrast, I use very different colors than you see in the landscape itself. And then I twisted the direction of the sky, because the sky usually is darker at the top and lighter towards the horizon, but it's difficult to explain, but this took me half a year to a year to get to this point. It was kind of a shift from all the work that was more figurative to a more abstract direction. This was kind of a breaking point. And I remember, not that I stopped making figurative work, but this was a work that started that I wanted to make. I've always had this brain for moving images, so I always made browser images, but I thought, can I finally also make a still? So I thought, let's make some ideas on composition that can work as drawings. So I was drawing in a cafe in Tokyo, I remember distinctly, and I thought, okay, what can I say about composition that has not been said yet? So I just started drawing lines, like in how many ways can you divide an area? So you have, that's the basic premise of a composition. You have a space and you have to arrange elements in that space. So in how many ways you could do it, cut it this way, you could do it halfway, or you could do it cutting everything in half, or randomly across an infinite amount of partitions. You could go diagonal, etc., etc. So I thought, okay, I'm going to come up with drawings. But then I finally understood that this is still more interesting as an interactive work than as a drawing. So what interested me here is that, the user decides on the composition. So you start with this, and then the user clicks here. That means the line is cut horizontally. You can click on the line and it empties again. This way it's vertically. And then every time you click, it cuts that area in half. So that was the basic premise for me, that the viewer decides on the final work, on the final instance of the work. So the work has an infinite amount of instances. And what I liked about abstract work is that it's fundamental research. So you're getting out any other discussion, you're just saying, I just want to talk about color and rhythm and the viewer deciding on the final form of the work. So that was an absolute point where I thought, this is what I want to discuss, this is the problem I want to address. So that became this work. And from that work, I started experimenting in that series, thinking about composition. And so that was a simple rule: cut the screen in half every time. And in this case, it means choose a point and then drag lines to that point. My figurative work tends to be quite funny, and that's always easier for a talk, because then I can hear that you guys are listening, because then you laugh. With abstract work, all I can hear is, that's interesting. But there's no expression for being mesmerized. So I have no idea if you guys are bored. So continuing with that problem of, you have the browser, which is always a different ratio and a different size. And how do you deal with composition there? So in this case, every so many seconds, the screen refreshes and there's a rule. So the rule here is it chooses one line and then chooses another line, but that stops until it finds another line. And then if you move your mouse like this, it goes a little faster. But I like this. To me, it feels like a computer that's thinking. So the computer is thinking, is like, maybe this, maybe that, maybe this. And to me, that seems to be the most interesting problem in computing now, is that computers can generate a lot of things, but computers cannot yet assess what's a good composition or what's a good photo. I think they're trying. Everybody has this library of a trillion photos they never look at. And then they're trying to build algorithms finding the most interesting photos for you. So maybe computers will figure it out, what is beautiful or what is interesting to us. In this case, there's many diagonal lines, and they're rotating. Each line is rotating across another point. And I often choose gradients in between because that way you don't have to use so many different colors. You can still see the different areas because the content is also moving. If I would choose solids, then sometimes two areas next to each other would have the same color. So then you don't have that problem. And so if I move left to right, the content of the areas moves. And if I move up and down, the lines move. So this is all just fundamental research. It's just basic properties of the mouse, basic properties of interaction, basic properties of color. Without attaching too much meaning, you can attach any meaning you want, but for me, there is none. This is a similar idea of these diagonal lines, but in this case, the diagonal lines bounce at the edge. That's what I call it, but as you can see, the line hits the edge and then goes back to the edge and then goes back to the edge. In the other case, they just move outside of the space. They don't consider the edge. In this case, if I click, it makes 5 to 7 lines from that center point, and that line starts to move outward. And so you can keep on clicking. Then of course you can wonder, is this still abstract, or does this look like ice or broken glass? There's really no part of me that ever thinks this work should be 100% abstract or 50% or 75%. Or it's really every work, even if it's figurative, I'm just figuring out a problem. So this is a very figurative work, but it's still, I'm just figuring out one problem. It's like, what do you do with your trash? Yeah, it goes on and on. And it's interesting to me that this basic problem of dividing the canvas, it's interesting that this property of the web is now called canvas, and that we have this history of the canvas, so let's call it a canvas. But this flexible, fluid canvas, how many problems, how many ways can you divide the area? In this case, you saw it before where I was using diagonals. In this case, the diagonals stop at the next diagonal. In the other case, the diagonals went straight through. So, and in this case, I added this gravity. When I say I also mean my programmer, because I don't code them. But I did add the gravity to add a sort of sense of negative emotion or fatality, but maybe other people will interpret it differently. But I like this sort of heavy feeling. This is another example. So it keeps cutting the screen in parts, so in half and in half and in half, but the areas keep pushing each other. And I'm interested, there's so many examples of abstract art, and it was very political, or it was very radical, and they wrote all these texts, like Mondrian wrote all these texts that he made this work so people could find the source of the universe by looking at them. And I often wonder if he really meant that, or if he really believed that, or if it was a sales pitch. So in this case, the computer keeps dividing infinitely, mostly from the center, but a little bit outside. So basically the way it works is I make a drawing, usually on paper. And I think, okay, how can we divide the area in how many ways? And the next step for me is to go to Illustrator and to try it out and see how it looks as a still. And then I speak to my programmer and we talk about how can we translate this to code. And it's called pseudocode, and that's kind of our conversation. So I show him 3 stills and I say, okay, it's going to start like this. There's going to be lines that stop at the next line. The gradient content is either going to be 90 degrees or 0. And then it's going to zoom. And I want it to keep dividing stuff, so the more you zoom in, it's actually still the same thing. Just like, what do you call the physics thing that is infinite? Yeah, there's many fractals, yeah. So it's a simplified fractal. And then what happens is we'll code it, he will make a prototype and I can play with all the values. And then I might end up with a completely different idea than I started. So maybe the ground idea didn't work, but some accident happens and it becomes a different work. But usually I really like the process of me bringing the still and maybe a storyboard, him translating it to code, and then playing with the values, because that's really when you add the emotion or the feeling of the work. This is again just cutting in half, cutting in half, cutting in half, cutting in half, but then they start pushing each other also. They're not pushing each other now. They're supposed to. Yeah, now he's pushing the others out. So that's really, it's a single idea, and it's just trying it in as many ways as possible. This is an example where it's less abstract because there's still a sense of depth. So this is also dividing the space, and the rule is here, there's one line at 0 degrees, one at 90, and one at 45, which kind of creates this feeling of space, like the corner of a room. And then you start creating all these corners of rooms, but they don't really make sense. So that is one part of my research, is that I've turned a problem into a solution. And the problem for me is this problem of abstract art in the computer, where it's just too easy. And it's just so arbitrary. Why should this be black? Or maybe it should be pink? I don't know. So then my approach has just been, okay, I'll leave it to the viewer. I'm not going to decide on the final form. I'll leave it to the viewer. That was one way of dealing with the intuition part of abstraction. Because when you make a figurative work like the trash can, it's pretty easy for me to say, okay, the trash can has to be there, it's about this size. The jello should be red because jello is usually red. I made the plate blue because it's a nice contrast, and then you put it in the middle. So it's not very subjective. It's pretty straightforward. I want to talk about the interaction of unrolling a piece of toilet paper. So I just make the simplest piece of toilet paper that you can still recognize. And then it's just about the interaction and the recognition of the object, and the object being in a browser instead of in the bathroom. Okay. So when it's figurative, the problem of composition is a lot easier. But when it's abstract, the way I deal with it usually is that I leave the problem of composition to the viewer. This is an example. So the circle knows where the edges of the canvas are, and then when it hits them it bounces. And then you can add or subtract circles. So that's sort of my path of abstraction, from very figurative to half figurative to all kinds. And then I want to talk about this work, Abstract Browsing, that I'm showing 2 tapestries in the exhibition. And it started with another work. No, not you. How much time have I been talking? Okay, yeah. So, I made too many websites. I can't find my way. So, in the early days of the web, bandwidth was very scarce, and one way of dealing with it is you could turn on image-free browsing. Some browsers had this option, which I also do on mobile. It's kind of nice, because mostly you want to see the text if you want to get the information. So it's a classic way of saving bandwidth, it's image-free browsing. But then I thought it's interesting to have the opposite, text-free browsing. So it's a plugin that you can turn on and off on Chrome. Here's the extension. 3,500 users already added. This item has been enabled. Okay, so I enabled it, and then I can go to NewYorkTimes.com. And then it's more chill. I mean, one of the interesting things to me about visiting a country where you don't understand the language is that you have this completely different experience. If you go to Japan, I think for a lot of foreigners, Japan is this wonderful playland with just colors and happy sounds. For the people who live there, it's terrible, and they all leave. It's prison, and they're being indoctrinated. You have to work hard, you have to be nice to your parents, you have to spend money. We don't understand that. We just see, hey. So that's kind of, abstraction for me is an escape. And it's like the world is too much, and then in these abstract problems I can narrow it down, and then my brain works better. So it makes me happy. And in this case, this was one step of just removing text. So everything still works. You can browse everything. There's just no text. So who knows what these guys are doing or what Donald Trump is saying. It's nice. We don't know what he's saying. Look, they're laughing. They're happy. So that's text-free browsing. And then I was thinking, what's another way of seeing the web? And it's abstract browsing. So it's a continuation of the same idea. And in this case, it just analyzes the web page. And web pages are built out of tables, borders, images, text blocks, divs. I don't even know because I don't code. I'm just pretending. And then, but basically the web is built out of different elements. And all these elements you can hide. You can say, okay, this element is this size, but don't show me the element, and instead show me just a red rectangle. And that other area, show me a pink rectangle. So I made a list of 10 colors, and then same thing, you go to NewYorkTimes.com, and then you abstract it. So I didn't think too much about it, I just made the plugin. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. But then I started thinking about it more, and what really interests me about these compositions is that they, well, there's many things that interest me. So one of the things that interests me is that they were made for different devices, and that a lot of them scale differently on different computers. So that's already this idea of a fluid composition. The other thing that interests me is that these compositions were made out of necessity. An abstract painter doesn't make a composition because it has to be a certain way to display information. So a painter will think, what's the best place for this rectangle? a startup or a digital company or a media outlet will think, what's the best place for this rectangle to get as many clicks as possible? So that's a very different approach. And then the other thing that interests me is that it's not just humans deciding, but it's also algorithms deciding. So they will place banners on different parts of the page, and they will check what happens, and they will check it in different regions, different times of the day, and the computer will start to learn, this deep learning AI thing, and it'll start thinking, okay, if we place the ads a little smaller, but in the middle of the article, we make more money. If we place this over there, we get more clicks, people read more content. So it becomes this machine that to me becomes an abstraction of complex society, because a complex society becomes this thing where there's all these kind of systems that listen to each other but don't really consider the user. I don't want to use the word capitalism, but it's kind of like that, where you're just looking for the most efficient solution. And you're not looking for the solution that makes people happier, you're not looking for the solution that brings more focus to the article, you're looking for the solution that makes the most money. Money is the common denominator. So there's all these approaches that have nothing to do with abstract painting. Because Mondrian was not thinking, if I move this more to the left, I'll get more clicks. That's a very different approach. And so back to even to my figurative work, what interests me also in these simplified approaches of, and it's the same way of thinking, is, okay, I have a medium that is a poor medium. It's not HD photography, it's not oil painting where you can use millions of colors. It's a very restricted medium, but the benefit of this medium is that it can spread. So there's many moments in the history of technology where the technology kind of results in uglier images, but they're easier to copy. And uglier, I don't really mean ugly, but poorer images. So when you think of the first printing press, of course a handwritten book was more beautiful than one that was printed. But the printed one wins because it gets copied more, and then you're going to start to make the most of it. Or if you think of Japanese woodblock prints, of course a full-scale oil painting is more detailed, but the woodblock print can spread, so that's interesting. So how can we make the most of that? So I call this abstraction for the sake of reproduction. So it's not abstraction out of a luxurious choice because, oh, I'm going to make abstract because I want to find the center of the universe. No, I'm going to make it abstract so it can spread. And that's a very different approach. And so that was my way of thinking of the abstract browsing, that this is an abstraction that did not come from luxury but from necessity. We have the shitty medium, which nobody has any attention for, and there's a million things going on. How can we maximize it? And so then I'm interested, okay, we have all these parameters, and some are terrible, some are wonderful, or let's not even quantify them as being good or bad. But then I want to see, what did that actually mean for composition? Because there's been so much fundamental research on composition, from Paul Klee to Kandinsky to people nowadays, but it all comes from the artist in the studio in front of the canvas, no restrictions. And my father's an abstract painter, and he used to smoke a lot, and he would sit in front of the painting and then smoke for 5 hours thinking about the next brushstroke. And then you have this opposite machine that is constantly listening to everybody, thinking, okay, let's put it there. So my final result is what interests me, is that you find compositions that painters would never come up with. That's basically the interesting thing for me. It's like no one thought to make this painting because it's just horrible. It's a spreadsheet painting. This is a Google inbox. So that's really my core interest, is to find compositions that painters would not come up with. And then there's tons of political, semantic, ideological things that you could argue, but the real core interest for me is just to find compositions that people didn't find. Reddit this is really HTML. You just recognize that's. If you think of HTML, you think of forums. No, this is Ask Me Anything on Reddit. So the process for me is just every morning or every other morning I go online and I browse. And I've always had this thing where I'm an artist, so I shouldn't browse too much, I should be making things. So I turned that problem into a solution. So I'll browse stuff, but I'll leave all the tabs open, and then at the end of the day, I'll abstract them all and take screenshots, and then at the end of the day, I've just been browsing like everybody does, and they feel bad about it, but then I've made 100 compositions. Like this is Pinterest. It's very recognizable, I think. Deathmetal.org. Yeah. Twitter. So the next phase for this was to turn these into tapestries, because it happened that I was invited for a residency in Istanbul, and we were invited to do something with local craftspeople. So the funny thing is, when I first made the plugin, I wanted the results to be very simple, so just a few rectangles. That's what I wanted. And then my programmer made the plugin, and we couldn't get it simple. And it took me a while to accept the ugliness and just, okay, no, that's really the web. So the first few were still like this. But then later, this is Yahoo. I started working with the textile lab in Tilburg in the Netherlands. And they have all the facilities and the craziest colors. So you'll see in the exhibition, it is very, very saturated. This is one that's in the exhibition. It's Google Drive. So it's these things that we look at every day, but when you're looking at it, you're looking at the function. You're not contemplating the composition. That's the LA Times. And you'll notice upstairs that you see a little bit of this texture, but all the colors that I use, or most of them, are built out of 2 or 3 threads at the same time. So I didn't know this, but when you weave, you always have 8 to 10 colors going either way, and a few of those threads will come to the front. And the blue, for example, is pure blue, it's just the thread color. But that means you have to have 2 blue threads on the front, and the rest is at the back. You only have 8 colors, so that means if you use pure blue, then there's less other colors than you can use. So the more colors you make that are made out of 2, you can make more combinations. So it's one of these restrictions that I remember from the Commodore, where in the Commodore you had, I think, 4x4 pixels, but you could only have 3 colors within those pixels. So it's those very similar limitations that I love. I love these stupid problems that other people might think are stupid, but I think, oh, that's very interesting because it'll generate ideas that I didn't come up with. So the sort of pink color you see over there is fluorescent orange with magenta, which turns out to sort of vibrate in front of your eyes. You'll see upstairs. I wouldn't have come up with that. My instinct would have been pick the brightest threads and that's it. But then it turns out that the combinations are much more difficult for the eye, which I thought was interesting. So here's Pinterest. And then the latest series, I added even more colors. So this is an ongoing thing, and I like the idea of, as the web develops and as things change, these tapestries and these compositions will develop. As the machines learn more about us and learn how to manipulate us better, we'll see how the compositions change. Yeah, a little side note is that the history of computing started with the history of weaving. So it was the first, when they started to make these punch cards that you know from organ music, which is like a cardboard long scroll with holes in them. That's binary information. So it's basically, there's a hole or there's no hole. And that was they started using that for weaving, so that was the first digital image format. And that was before the concept of a calculator or a computer, but it was one of the building blocks of the ideas of computing. So that's a nice loop. Yeah, I think that's it.